if you remember, before Gandhiji came to India, the Congress party was an elitist party. It was made up of people who were educated, or a lot of them were lawyers and businessmen. It was not really connected with the masses. Masses did not understand the idea of India, did not understand the idea of independence. And Gandhiji realized that if he was to create a movement where he used the idea, where if you say, what was the motivation? The idea of, being freedom, etc. But then he translated this abstract ideas into some very specific things. Rare cut, don't pay salt tax. When he did the Dandi March, he went from Sabarmati Ashram to the Dandi beach. It took 35 days. So people would walk for 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers with him. It became a mass movement because of this mass contact. We say in marketing is that there is the IDA model, right? Behavior science is saying is that model is wrong. Sony had just bid for the cricket rights to the World Cup, and before that, all the ICC tournaments for a massive amount of money. It was 3 times more than what Star had paid the previous round. And so the question was, the target was much larger. If you're going to raise the price 3 times what people had paid earlier, would clients be willing to pay? And ultimately that is the thing. So we had no choice but to say we have to expand the reach of cricket.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Sell-Side Conversations. Our guest today is Suman Srivastav. Suman is an advertising guru, author, teacher, social worker, and as per him, a creative bartender. Suman was the CEO and Chief Strategy Officer at EuroRSCG. In a conversation with Suman, we'll talk about advertising, we'll talk about the books he's written, namely Marketing Unplugged and Don't Beg, Inspire. And lastly, we'll talk about his work in the social sector. Hi Suman, welcome to Sell-Side Conversations. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, Gautam. Oh, good to see you after a long time.
Thank you. So Suman, in our conversation, we'll just cover a few topics. One is we'll cover about your life as an advertising man, some of the great creative work that you've done at EuroRSCG and some of the clients you've worked with. Second part we'll cover is some of the books you've written, some nuggets from the books. And third part is we'll obviously focus upon the social work that you're doing. So let's start off with your original love, if I were to say that, is advertising. Can you tell us about the process of how a great campaign is created? What is the behind the scenes strategy, thinking? Just walk us through that process.
Right. So I think I want to focus on the fact that the marketing strategy is actually developed by the client, and thereafter the agency gets involved. Now, obviously, that's not always the case. So let's take a case of Hindustan Unilever, where obviously the marketing is done by them. They are the experts at it. And they'll give you a very, very strong marketing brief. The brand is very well defined, the positioning and everything else, our audience, all of that. I think where the agency tends to add value is in converting that into a communications brief. And that's where, people in account planning or strategic planning get more involved. Because, for example, if I say the word premium, different audiences will interpret the word differently. What does premium mean? Or for that matter, symbolism. Which is the color for premium? For some people, black may be the color for premium. For some other people, gold might be the color for premium, etc. Right? So, or red or something else. So each of these words and how it is decoded by people is something that the agency gets involved with. And in order to do that, there has to be a lot of research. Of course, there's research done at the client end in arriving at the proposition or the positioning a concept or whatever it is on the brand. But at the agency end, we might want to do other work, which may or may not be specific to the brand. It may be specific to an audience, for example, youth or we did a study on small town India. We called it the Bunty syndrome, which was
What is that Bunty syndrome?
Yeah, so this whole idea that, Bunty and Babli, the movie had come out, and it was that aspirational thing for India. And this was soon after the 2007 World Cup, which Dhoni was the captain. And if you remember, in that team, there was only one player from Metro, which was Rohit Sharma from Bombay. Everybody else was from a small town, from Karachi and Baroda and, all kinds of Raebareli and, smaller places. And it was like the because of media, because of various other things that had happened, the opening up of the economy, the Indian consumer had become a lot more aspirational, especially the small towns consumer. And while it was happening in the big cities as well, the delta, the change was much greater in the small cities.
Oh,
Now, that was an insight that we captured.
so this is called the Bunty Babli effect or something? Is there a
We
term
just
for
called it that. We called it the Bunty effect.
Okay.
Later on, Ernst and Young actually did a study which was based on our study, and then they wanted to use Bunty syndrome, but of course, so then they called it the Dhoni effect. And in fact, maybe they popularize it more, so they can say Dhoni effect. But the idea is the same, that suddenly Middletown India, Middle India, let's say, had become aspirational. Youth in Middle India had dreams which were far greater than ever before, and they were achieving it. I mean, you've seen people from Indore, for example, creating these dot-com empires,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and so on. So these kind of things started to happen. And how does that reflect for everybody else? Not just the people who are successful, but the people around them who are looking at these successes. Well, what does it mean in terms of the brands that they're consuming, the products that they're buying? So these are all things that the agency tends to do. And we tend to therefore write a communication brief which can be built on that marketing brief. Of course, there are other kinds of clients. So that's for the Hindustan Lever type client. There's the other kind of client who's not as sophisticated, perhaps in marketing, where the agency might be even more involved with the marketing side of the brief, and then arrive at.
Good.
And of course, today we can say there is the third client who doesn't have the time to do any research. And I suppose, it's with the speed of change and everything, I think people are not doing research at all. That's just as far as the strategic side is.
Do you find brands not doing research? Any examples you think of a brand which is launched fairly popular but not in-depth research has gone behind it? So some things.
So I feel that, especially when you look at a lot of startups, they seem to be, it's worked in the US, so let's see if it works in India kind of thing. They're Me Too kind of brands, and you're throwing things at the wall and hoping something sticks. So they're not based on genuine insights. They're not, in many cases, the insights are coming in later, and sometimes very successfully. So, for example, if I look at e-commerce and say that, Flipkart started out, both those guys had worked in Amazon in the US, etc. They came to India, they started Flipkart. But Flipkart was not a success until they got the insight about the fact that people do not trust the process. And you're like, oh, once I give money, will I get the goods? What if I don't? And therefore, cash on delivery
Yeah.
became the killer application which enabled e-commerce to start. Absolutely. Now, that was an insight which came much later, right? But once they got it, they then flew with it, and they created a whole industry which was based on that. It's a good example of, starting out without the insight, and maybe that's fair. Maybe that's the new world where, move fast and break things.
And any example where it's not stuck on the wall? I mean, it's flipped around and it's fallen down.
No, there are many examples of brands that have not done well. And I think that maybe today you can look at the larger marketing behemoths, if you like, and say, without taking names, I'm saying that if they're very large marketing companies, then you say they launched a successful brand in the 21st century. We're now 25 years, a quarter of a decade in, and there are companies which are relying on their brands that were created earlier. Maybe they've got relaunches and restages, but they're not new brands or new success, or there have been some new brands but have not succeeded. And so these are complicated things, and it's not very easy to see. And maybe they're new categories.
So brand is a summation of so many things. It is not only design, the product, the experience. It's a summation of a lot of things that go into making a brand.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now, when the brief comes and obviously the agency gets to work. Now you obviously done some great work at Pure RSAG with the Sony Max campaign. Can you talk us through that process, or what was the highlight about that?
Right. So the background is that Max had just won, rather Sony had just bid for the cricket rights to the World Cup, and before that, all the ICC tournaments for a massive amount of money. It was, 4 times more or 3 times more than what Star had paid the previous round. And so the question was, therefore, the target was much larger. It was And the question was that if you're going to raise the price three times what people had paid earlier, would clients be willing to pay? And ultimately that is the thing. So we had no choice but to say we have to expand the reach of cricket. And you look at cricket and you say, wow, cricket can't.
So who came up with this inference that the market has to be expanded? Was it like a joint process between the agency and the client, or was it based on some insight, or just because I pay you humongous sum of money, I need to recover it, so let me go to as many people as possible?
No, it wasn't as many people because so in fact that was part. It was part of the challenge from the client, right? Which was part of the pitch brief, if you like. That our target is a lot higher,
Okay.
three times larger. And how do we do this? And so our strategy coming into that was to say, how do we get women involved? Because the history is that 85% of viewers were men. And therefore, only brands that are interested in targeting men were involved, right? That to youth. So youth and men, that's the kind of focus that cricket used to be. And we said we have to get the women involved who were watching soaps and everything else. And so the whole pitch idea was around extra inning, what became extra innings.
Extra innings.
Right. So the whole idea that can we create wraparound programming, which is not just about cricket, but is around cricket. So can we get mythology and cricket? Can we get film stars and cricket? Can we connect cooking and cricket, sightseeing, tourism and cricket, and so on and so forth, and package all of that in an entertaining way, such that that by itself, which had no viewership earlier, right? Nobody wanted to watch. People want to watch live cricket, not necessarily the wraparound. And we made that powerful. In fact, our winning thing about that was that when there was a Zimbabwe versus Kenya match, the extra innings before that was among the top 10 shows of the country
Oh, really?
on that week, which was amazing because that was a win for us because then we got people who was hooked onto this. We also got huge numbers of women watching the show, nearly 50-50. I mean, it used to be 15% of viewers were tended to be women. So the whole thinking was
Full Mandira Bedi also was introduced into that series.
Mandira Bedi, all of that. And we made mistakes. The good thing was that we had the Champions Trophy, which took place in Sri Lanka in end of 2002, and the World Cup in 2003. So we had an opportunity to test run our strategy for in Sri Lanka, and then do the grand rollout, if you like, in 2003, and it was highly successful. It won creative awards, it won all kinds of things. So that's one part of it, which is say, how do we attract women? The other part of it is to say that all sporting events are always about war. The analogy is always war.
Correct.
Bakraman and something or the other. It's always so-and-so versus so-and-so.
War paint on the face and all of those things happen.
Yeah, and it's this very macho kind of way, and and the whole idea was, can we have a different metaphor, if you like, for sports, right? And how does the media brand present itself? Because finally, the way media has always talked about is through content. So it was almost like, I've got cricket, therefore come and watch me. Or I've got this great movie, so come and watch me.
Absolutely.
It really didn't matter that the movie was being, or the cricket was being watched on Sony or Star or any other. And we said, no, that must not be it. We must brand the channel. And therefore, the experience of watching cricket on Sony must be different from Star. And we started thinking about that and saying, who do you like watching cricket with? And maybe you like watching with a knowledgeable friend, who's as crazy about cricket as you are perhaps, but knows a little bit more and therefore improves your entertainment because he or she might therefore give you some tidbits or some stories which you didn't have before. And so we decided that's the personality that Max would have. And therefore the idea ki Deewana bana de, because we are so crazy about cricket that we will make you crazy about cricket too. And we extended that. We are so crazy about movies that we make you crazy about movies too, etc., etc. So that was the insight that we got into. And therefore, the whole strategy came out from there because we were then able to attract women and we were able to attract the male audience and so on and so forth. And maybe we had some cricket Puritans who were not very happy with us. But on the other hand, we were a monopolist, right? You couldn't watch cricket anywhere else. So
absolutely.
to that extent, the cricket crazy guy, we didn't have to get. He was going to come anyway. We had to get the other consumer. And
so this research happens, is it like how does the research process work? Because something like this, I would imagine would require a primary research going and talking to people, or is it an online version? How do brands sort of manage that, and how did you manage in this case?
Back then, no online research was. We are talking 2002, 3, where, online was tiny, if at all. Uh, and the other problem is that when you want representative samples, it's very hard to get it online. I think today you are much better off because things have changed, but I'm talking about back then. So therefore, it was always in person. Now, there are two kinds of research: there's quantitative and qualitative. And uh, as account planners, we have focused a lot more on qualitative research because the numbers are there. Usually, the clients guess the number. They do all the these are big studies across nationwide, all of that. But when you want deep insights, you have to do these qualitative research. You have to do focus groups or in-depth interviews, etc. So
I think that is what your book also talks about. So we'll come to that. But
yeah.
yeah,
So there are various ways in which you get those insights, and you've got to do a lot of culture mapping. You have to be on top of culture. What is happening with culture at different points in time? Like the example I gave of the Bunty syndrome, or things like that. We had done another study at Euro, which we call the remix generation, which was more metro kind of a study, which looked at this generation that, because of globalization and the opening up of the economy, was remixing everything, not just the music, but also the way the language itself. It was much more English.
correct.
It was the fashion. It was culture and everything else about culture that we were taking. So these are insights that also you have to be doing all the time, and you have to merge that with the brand the needs.
Interesting. Then you were also involved with some other notable launches. One was with uh, Red FM, I guess.
Yeah. So, media has been a passion for me,
Okay.
media brands actually. And this whole idea that, um, you know, I think that media brands have tended to only focus on the content and not worry about the brand itself. And I think that, uh, in my career, I've had the opportunity to work with several media brands. To begin with, mass media brands like we spoke about, Sony and Max. We launched Red FM, where the whole idea at that time was, about this Aam Aadmi. And
Okay.
I mean, I know Aam Aadmi Party came later, but there was the whole thought about, uh, uh, you know, which had happened in a earlier campaign in Congress campaign, etc. Anyway, so there was this whole idea of Aad Aadmi ka kya hoga, and so therefore this thing of Red FM, and again the FM market at that time was always thought of itself as an MTV on radio.
Okay.
We want to be these cool guys, and all the RJs were always these cool people, and they were trying to play music which was slightly more for this car driving audience. And again, it was a straight lift from the West, because in the West people listen basically to FM in their cars. Whereas the India insight was that most of the listeners of radio are shopkeepers
Oh, really?
and taxi drivers and housewives and students when they are studying.
Not office
etc.
goers?
Yeah. So at that time, we looked at that and said that something like, I mean, I forget my numbers exactly, but something like 85% of listenership of the radio was static. Because the number of car owners anyway are very small, and those days there was no mobile, etc. So in any case, that whole FM thing was actually, you were replacing All India Radio, and you were listening to music with a static audience. And suddenly we said that while everybody is going after this SECA plus whatever kind of audience, let us go to SEC B and C.
Ah, okay.
And therefore, this whole thing of focus on
So this came from a deep insight.
into the consumer, and therefore saying what are the issues that they are concerned with. We'd had that was just after the Bombay floods had happened, and and basically the whole idea that आवाज उठाते रहो, Red FM बजाते रहो, was our overall line. So the idea that the Aam Aadmi could raise his voice against things, and therefore Red FM became the channel which was always talking on behalf of the common man, and therefore the affinity of Red FM with the consumer, so that you like the brand Red FM beyond just liking the music that they were
I
playing.
think they still maintain that same activism sort of a stand, their brand
right.
positioning, that they still maintain that.
And we took that same idea into Dainik Bhaskar. Now, see, Dainik Bhaskar again, has had a phenomenal record, which is entirely because of the client and the family, their own said, where they were number one in Madhya Pradesh for decades. And then they got out of Madhya Pradesh with innovative strategy that made them number one literally the day they launched in every new market, whether it was Rajasthan or, I mean, literally they won that in state after state and they just, so that's a whole marketing case study in itself. But the problem with that was that in each of those states, there was a heritage newspaper brand, which was always regarded as with a great deal more respect than Dainik Bhaskar. So Dainik Bhaskar was seen as this Johnny come lately who's very flashy and youthful, but not somebody that I want to respect.
Okay.
And therefore, we needed to say, okay, how do people respect Dainik Bhaskar? And it was compared to, say, Rajasthan Patrika, which was an equally venerated paper, and in Rajasthan was very strong, and so on and so forth. And the whole idea, again, came from, in fact, came out of this Bunty syndrome and things like that, about that the new India and what their aspirations were, which is what, and we in fact used Dhoni as our brand ambassador,
Oh, really?
the
Okay.
Dainik Bhaskar campaign, and therefore, the whole thing of, uh, you know, we got the whole thing happening with Dainik Bhaskar as well, became the voice of the new generation, if you like.
So when all these cases are based on consumer insights, and those deep insights have led to a communication strategy. Have you seen in your set of clients where the insights are there, but still the brand has not taken off, or somehow things have not fallen into place?
I'd like to say that if your strategy is right,
Hmm.
you will always get to 5 on 10. Then your creative can take you to 8, 9, maybe 10 if you're lucky. If your strategy is wrong, the best creative will not get you anywhere.
True.
Right? And if your strategy is sort of okay kind of thing, creative has to do all the hard work to take you up from 0 or 1 to all the way to wherever it reaches. So really the job of good strategy is to ensure that you don't make very bad mistakes, right? You always do well. You will always get to 5. And then it's up to creative to take it to 6 or 7, or then maybe to take 8, 9, 10. So I think that, if you
So
did,
what are the top 3 components of a strategy? Just for our users or listeners, what are the basic framework for a strategy?
well, ultimately, marketing is about STP, or segmentation, targeting, velocity. So that doesn't change. I think the question is, did you get that segment right? How are you segmenting the market? It's kind of like, because there is a follow the leader effect in most categories. Like I just said with FM, everybody's going after the top end. When you realize that top end is not where the market is, the market's below. So can we go there, and how do we go there, etc. Right? So that sort of thing, which is what you're trying to work on. And therefore, did you get the target right? Do you get that, and then what are the insights that you get? And therefore, how do you position the brand? So it's not rocket science. It's fairly straightforward.
Sometimes it seems like common sense, but oftentimes the common sense is missing, right?
Correct.
That's where you have so many brands sort of just falling
Yeah.
off the
And I
cliff.
think you need time. You need time to study. You need time. I think that, we can talk a lot about the advertising industry, but I think in general, there is a need for the creative industry. I think today we've got a situation where people seem to think that it's a commodity. Anybody can make an ad, or I can go to the filmmaker and get an ad made, or, what's an ad, and I can get it done for very, very cheaply, these days almost, for the internet or something like that. But the reality is that you're not getting these kind of insights. You're not getting the deeper insights that really build brands. You're getting brands that are transactional. So where are the brands that are building new relationships, right? Or they're being built not through marketing and communication, but from the product itself. So maybe you have a relationship with Google, or you have a relationship with Facebook, or with, say, Amazon, or whatever, or Flipkart, or etc. But those relationships are experiential relationships.
Transactional relationships.
That's right. And so tomorrow, if somebody comes in and says, "Oh, I'm cheaper than Amazon," or "I'm cheaper than Uber," well,
The switchover happens immediately
correct.
because there's no sort of a
Yeah.
loyalty.
And you can see that, right? Rapido comes in, and suddenly now it's the new thing. And,
Correct.
suddenly Ola and Uber are not quite as is Rapido. And then somebody else will try and upset Rapido. I mean, where does that stop? And this is the problem I think brands ultimately do two things. One is get you a premium if you are on par, and sometimes will get people to buy it even if they are not the best technology. I mean, a good case point today is Vodafone. I mean, just I'm talking to people who are still Vodafone users and say, the experience is not so great. They only just launched 5G after, Geo and Airtel have had it forever. But people have stuck to it because it's a strong brand, because, it people love the brand. And I think that that's really what branding does for you. And so, on the one hand, we're talking about consumers who become very transactional, but that same consumer is actually willing to stay on with a brand because he or she loves that brand. And I think that that's the question that you have to ask. Do you want strong brands, or do you just want transactional brands?
Correct. I think it's a good point you make, because a lot of clients, some clients will want a transactional relationship to meet their short-term goals, and some of them would, the longer horizon, will say, okay, let me build a relationship with the client.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
Interesting. So Suman, let's move on to some of the books that you've written. Okay, now, one of them is obviously Marketing Unplugged, is right behind you over there. Now, I've sort of skimmed read it. I've not read it. Full disclosure over here. Can you sort of talk us through some of the elements in the book? Because what I've got is some bit of behavioral economics over there, human psychology over there, and some interesting case studies about the Nirma and I think is it Surf Wars and some white cola. There's a couple of examples over there. Can you sort of talk us through those things?
Yeah. So let me step back a bit and say that, when I was at Euro RSCG and I was, I know I've always thought of myself as a planner,
Okay.
as a strategy guy, and I didn't think that my heart was not in being CEO. Okay, but Ishan Raina, who's been a guest on this podcast before, I mean, he was my boss for the longest time, and he said, "How do you know you won't like being CEO? You've never been CEO." I was, okay, fine, and because of him, I ended up becoming CEO. So I did that for 5 years, but I think my heart was always in strategy. And I'd become CEO in my early 40s. And then the whole thing was, after 5 years, I looking forward to say, if I'm working for another 15, 20 years, do I continue to be CEO? And I really didn't think that I was possible. And as it happened, you know, Pranesh Mishra, whom I respect a lot, and I met him. We were speaking at an event together, and so on. And one thing led to another, and I started thinking about, is there an opportunity for a brand consulting firm, basically, and can we have a logic for it? And so the original thinking behind what became Marketing Unplugged was actually done along with Pranesh,
Okay.
actually for Pranesh, because the idea was that I can get into partnership with Pranesh, which didn't happen for various reasons. So Marketing Unplugged was meant to be the manifesto for my consulting company, which
Okay.
coincidentally I also called Marketing Unplugged, well, not coincidentally, was the whole idea that marketing has become too mechanized. It's become too process driven, right? I mean, it's almost like, can you play great music out of a synthesizer, right? A computer can play great music, but is it great music? And that if you want to play great music, you probably need the unplugged, you need your guitar, your harmonium, or whatever
All of
it
these
is.
things. Absolutely.
And then you will create music, and I think that's the whole idea of marketing.
Even more so now, I can see marketing is becoming like a formula.
Yeah.
Okay, make a creative, run it on Meta, run it on Google, and see the result that comes out of it, and iterate on those things. So it's sometimes like a formula. Most marketers, at least they call themselves marketers, subscribe to that, and I always find it difficult. There's no storytelling. There's no emotional connect that people try to build over here.
And and various other things. So this formula, as you said, this formula is become very well known. Back in the 60s, maybe only Procter and Gamble or Hindustan Lever, Coca-Cola, and companies like that had the formula, and nobody else knew that formula. And so it was fine, because then they built brands on it. But then everybody else learned that formula and started to apply it. And so then it became just a process, like you were asking earlier. Okay, I'll write a brief. It'll have you know, I'll have a target audience and a proposition, blah, blah, blah. I do some research and I'll put it out. Uh, so the whole point is that finally it's about creativity. And again, the creativity is meant to be, the creative guys will think of something. But what about the strategy? Can the strategy be creative? And so Marketing Unplugged is actually a manifesto for being more creative with strategy and saying, there's so many different ways. I mean, just take a very simple thing like brand identity. Okay. Back then, you said brand identity had to be perfect. This is my blue, mera wala cream. This is my brand color. This is my brand font. This is the way my brand will always appear, etc., etc., etc. And that worked for a certain period of time, especially when your audience was often illiterate. And so, therefore, they had to see this blue pack in a certain dazzle, and they knew it was surf or it was something else, or parachute or something like that.
Got it.
But today, you look at Google, and every morning it changes the logo,
Oh yes.
and MTV changes its bug, and you're saying, but today the consumer is very different, and you do not need to say that brand identity has to be the same way. Google changes its font also almost on a daily basis, right? What stays is some colors and maybe an attitude and a relationship, etc. Something does not change. Not everything changes. But therefore, what does brand identity mean in today's world? And that's the kind of questions that I'm asking in Marketing Unplugged. It's been 10-year-old now, nearly. And so those are the kinds of things. And looking at different aspects. But how do you do research? I mean, again, if you do research in a formulaic way, you will get formulaic insights. I wouldn't even call them insights because they would be formula.
Correct.
So you have to do research in a different way, maybe. So I've looked at different aspects of.
And give some examples to sort of bring.
Yeah. So,
Or
for
the clients.
example, in Marketing Unplugged, I was working with CaratLane, and we were looking at selling jewelry online.
Okay,
This
that's
was a
interesting.
very difficult task. People said, "Oh, I'm not going to buy jewelry online." But the way the research was done, and it was with the research agency, so full credit to them as well, is that we created a group on WhatsApp. We had all the people who were on the group to meet physically for a 2 hour get to know each other kind of session. And then we said, we're going to put all of you on a WhatsApp group. You can check. And every day we will ask you a question, right? For one whole month. And so 5 days, whatever, 4 weeks. And 5 days a week for 4 weeks. So 20 days, we will ask you a question every day. You have to answer that question. Other than that, you can do whatever you want, etc. So we actually had a lot of conversation, but the results were beyond our wildest dreams because we started out talking about all kinds of things, not just
So what kind of questions were asked, and
so
what
it was
was
on
the
marriage, it was
inference?
on relationships, it was on beauty, it was on fashion, it was on just being a woman, feminist issues. So it was a very wide range of questions, and our questions were quite simple. They were very broad kind of questions, but the insights we got were so deep because here were people who had the time to think of what they were saying, who were responding to what other people were
So
saying.
what were the top 3 inferences that came out?
Oh, there was a lot of it. But
Okay.
but I think what came through was this, the confidence of this new woman that we were talking with. The idea that she doesn't want to be treated like in the, shall we say, quote unquote, womanly way. The
Okay.
standard again, let's make it floral, let's make it pink, let's make, come on, that's not this whole idea of what are their ambitions with the career, even the way they want to look at men, etc. So I think that we got a lot of very deep insight, which may not immediately translate into an ad right away, but it is important for the brand. The idea that they're buying jewelry for themselves. They don't necessarily need someone else to buy it for them. And, there are only few people who are allowed to buy it for them. So again, I think it was very rich. A lot of it we wouldn't have got if we hadn't had a whole month to chat with them. And also because, I think they got comfortable with themselves. So you couldn't just do it if they were strangers. So the idea that we got them to meet together, I
Then
think more
as a result of the research and the inference, what was the next logical step that happened?
So again, the CaratLane has been a very successful brand.
Absolutely,
I think the exit has been very good
Wonderful.
for the owner, and it's now a strong brand for Tanishq. And even though Tanishq has bought it, it has continued with the CaratLane brand name, and it continues
True.
to be a strong brand. I think the whole idea of selling jewelry online is such a tough proposition. Continues.
Yeah,
to
but I
go
think
with
these
it.
guys sort of disrupted the market and created a whole category. There's
Category.
Blue Stone, there's Carrot Lane, there's whole
Because
bunch of
again,
them.
because back then, again, if you look at the category convention, is I wear jewelry to look beautiful, okay, or I wear jewelry to be attractive to a man, and you got to say, well, I contest that. Maybe I wear jewelry to look confident, to be confident. It's an innermost thing. And we often in CaratLane spoke about the inner woman rather than the outside. And can we make that, especially for the everyday jewelry, which was the segment that CaratLane is in, right? Because she's not. I mean, this idea it's a male chauvinistic thing, right? To say that
True.
women wear jewelry so as it's good for men. I mean, maybe not.
I know.
You know.
Suman, any other examples of apart from CaratLane? We covered a few of
So
them.
we can keep going
Yeah,
like
but maybe another example. I think I was reading somewhere about the Surf and Nirma example that you quote over there. I think Surf and Nirma are still
and
brands out.
yeah.
They still exist, but maybe ever you
Yeah. So I mean,
or the white coke, or the white cola, the white coke,
that Coke and
diet coke.
yeah. So I think that anyway. So let me just do the the detergent wars, because I think that obviously the history of that is probably pretty well known now. But let me just recap it in the sense that Nirma came in and looked at this market and said, "Let me come out with a product which is cheap and cheerful, and let me just So they came out with a product which was one third the price, the unit price of Surf, and totally disrupted the market, right? Because basically most people in India at that time use a laundry bar, which is or a detergent bar to wash clothes. They weren't even using powder because powder was this premium, expensive thing. So what they did was that they expanded the market. They expanded the market so much that even though Surf's market share fell from about 54% to 9%, the volumes doubled,
Okay,
right?
the
Because the
market
market exploded.
exploding. Correct.
The market exploded from being about 25,000 tons to being 300,000 tons. And now it must be even higher. I don't even. So they just exploded the market, and therefore, even though Surf technically lost market share, it kept gaining in volume. So then the whole thing was that okay, from a portfolio point of view of Hindustan Lever, they got in wheel to fight against Surf, fight against Nirma, because it was the same price point. And then they have to take Surf to the next level and say, okay, now we are the premium brand, and then, and so on. So that's the part of the war that I was involved with.
Okay.
When we took this whole Surf thing and took it to the next level, we already had Lalitaji, who'd been there being the smart Indian housewife who was fighting against saying, don't degrade to Nirma. But now she became more genteel and she became more upscale, and she wasn't now talking about Nirma in every ad, and she moved on to the next level. And then we launched Surf Excel, which actually came in because Ariel had got launched at that time. And so then that whole battle. And so there were fascinating battles where I learned a lot just from marketing, from all the great marketers that I worked with and Instant Diva and stuff. Very different is the cola wars, because I think that in the cola wars, and this is just more an example of what I was talking earlier in terms of how people decode symbols, right? And the whole idea that Diet Coke and Coke Zero may probably be very similar things. I mean, I don't know it, and
Even I don't know the difference. I mean, sometimes I say Diet Coke, sometimes I see
Coke Zero. Now,
Coke
what
Zero.
does it mean? But and
The color of the can is different.
the can is different, and that makes such a big difference, because suddenly there is this silver color can which is Diet Coke, and people say it's a little soft, and then there is this black color Coke Zero, and somehow it's more it's more Coke, right? Or it's much more Coke, and therefore Coke Zero started to do very well. And I don't know this, and Coke will probably sue me for saying that it's the same liquid. It's probably not, but really it's very similar to most consumers. They probably can't make any difference, but the packaging makes such a big difference. In fact, there's another case where Coke, the main Coke, the red Coke, was doing a promo with the World Wildlife Fund, okay, for the polar bear, and they made the can white because that was a promotional pack for the polar bear. And people said, "You've changed the taste of Coke. It's gone flat because it became white." And so then they had to rechange it and make red with a little white band at below, so to make no, they haven't changing, it's still red. And so again, people's taste perceptions change because the packaging changed.
Interesting. And on to the next book, which is obviously a little to do with the social
Yeah.
work, but let's sort of get some basic elements out of that. It's called Don't Beg Inspired, and it's more to do with the social sector. where some part is the fundraising part, some part is about how you can use principles of marketing for social services or social causes. Could be an NGO or could be any organization of that sort. Can you just walk us through some of those elements over here?
So in some ways, I mean, obviously, it reflects the way my life has also gone because, frankly, I've been working in the social sector for 20 years now.
Or
So
very long,
parallel
huh?
to my advertising career. So I started in 2005 because a friend of mine who was in the sector pulled me into project. And then, there has been some amount of, overlap and I've been getting in more and more involved to the extent that now that's all I do. I'm fully involved only with the social sector. So right through this whole phase, if you like, this 20-year period, I felt that the sector could do with a lot of the marketing process, if you like, uh, would help over there. Having said that, not exactly the way we use it in the corporate world, but has to be different. And so don't Beg, Inspire comes from that thing. So it uses some of the thinking that is there in Marketing Unplugged, which is talking about, behavioral economics and, those kind of insights, but then also taking into account that we're not selling anything here. We're not trying to say classically that, I am the better NGO because. So we're not doing positioning. If there is no positioning, we're now talking purpose, right? We're now, instead of instant gratification, we're talking about behavior change. Instead of talking big advertising dollars, we're talking about creating movements. So to me, these are the three key pillars that, are important for marketing in the social sector. So essentially purpose, behavior change, and movements become the three key pillars. And using these three pillars, you start talking about how social purpose organizations. So they could be NGOs, they could be social enterprises, could be whatever, but the purpose is social.
So can you give an example of any organization or an entity which follows all the three principles
Oh yeah,
and does it well?
right. So there are lots of them, and I'll come to that in a second. But I'm just saying that social purpose organizations need to do one of four things, right? So one is, of course, they all need to raise money. So fundraising is an important part. But then most of them are trying to create some kind of social change, right? We're trying to fight against inequality, for example. It could be gender, it could be caste, it could be something else. We're talking maybe about changing something else to do with the environment. We want people to be more, use less plastic or something else, right? So you're trying to create some kind of social change. Maybe we're trying to advocate for a cause because you want people privileged or people in power to behave a little differently, change policies, etc. So that could be the third thing. And the fourth is that you have to engage with people, whether it's the people within the organization, the people just outside they work with, or any other donors, anybody else that you need to influence for your work. And so the whole idea is that you can use these three pillars, if you like, or this marketing process in all of them, right? So again, we can talk about very big organizations like, for example, Red, as a Red with brackets, which is this Bono created this anti-AIDS campaign, which is very global, and is one of the most successful fundraising campaigns, which credited with having helped to bring down cost of AIDS medicines and therefore saving millions of lives in Africa. But it came out of this very successful Red campaign where he went to companies and he said, make one more. So if you make a phone, make a red color phone. You have a range of, let's say, t-shirts. Make one extra range which is labeled red. If you have a restaurant, you say one page, the items on this page are red, etc. So then, and the proceeds from that product or the profits, give it to us as charity. So, and then they would do this campaign which went out and said red is for fighting AIDS and so on and so forth. And then that became a very fabulous way to
So it
raise.
sort of also followed all the three principles:
Yeah,
purpose,
it was purpose
movement, and the
and behavior change,
behavior
because we're
change.
not, because again, the one of the things is that the social sector talks about very long term things. I want to get rid the world of AIDS, or I want to create a class, a society where both all genders are. We don't know when that will happen. So you have to bring it down in terms of something more specific. Therefore, a behavior change. right? Something which is more, okay, go and do this, use less plastic, or, buy this product for, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can make that behavior change, a lot of that change starts to change.
With the useless plastic, that behavior change has happened, at least in metro cities and among a certain segment of demographic of people are very conscious about not using plastics and all of those. So I think that change is
Yeah.
slow and gradual.
Yeah. And if you might have heard of Earth Hour, right?
Hmm.
And Earth Hour was started by a set of teenagers in Sydney.
Okay.
There's some kids in Sydney saying, what can we do? And they convinced the mayor of Sydney
To shut down the lights.
to shut, well, not centrally, but to back the campaign, shut lights for 1 hour in one day. So it's basically the last Sunday of March every year. It's 8:30 p.m. in India. And from now, they've gone to some thousands of cities across the world. And because of that, because they've got so many millions of people, therefore their voice is heard. It's now part of World Wildlife Fund, and they're doing advocacy. They're managing to create a lot of change in a lot of societies because of what they're able to do. So again, now this abstract idea of environment, you are now making it quite specific by saying Earth Hour. And even if you don't switch off the lights, the point is that you do this. Similarly, another very successful campaign that most people may have heard of was the Ice Bucket Challenge,
Oh yes.
right? And so what happened is that this is for a disease called ALS. Now, unfortunately, ALS is a disease that I'm very familiar with because my father-in-law died of it, and now a very close friend of mine who was my colleague in Euro RSCG recently passed away because of this. Now, this is a disease where your mind's fine, your muscles are fine, but the nerves connecting them are not working. They start to die. And so what happens is it starts with your extremities and tips of your toes and
Absolutely. Yeah.
fingers and so on, and then it moves out. And so the ice bucket, what it does is when you put cold water on yourself, for a moment you get numb
Ah.
on, and that's how ALS patients start to feel. But it doesn't talk overtly about ALS or anything. It just does this and says, this is for you, and then names 5 other friends, and then there are all these videos and so on. And initially it's like, what is this challenge? What is this ice bucket challenge? And then people start reading about it and people start finding out. So what we say in marketing is that there is the IDA model, right? Awareness, interest, desire, action, this funnel.
Correct.
And what behavior science is saying is that that model is wrong.
Okay.
It's actually the upside down. If you create action, then people will want to get awareness on themselves. And that new kind of awareness is much stickier than the other kind. Because otherwise, when you try to create awareness, it comes in through one ear, out the other. People forget, right? They're not engaged.
Awareness through action is much more long lasting.
Yeah. And therefore, whether you look at Earth Hour, whether you look at Ice Bucket Challenge, or various other things that I've written about in the book, when you create that behavior, then the awareness and the involvement with the whole thing. So, for example, after Ice Bucket Challenge, you had 15x increase in number of Google searches for ALS.
Oh yes.
You had a 20-time increase in the amount of donation. Sorry, what am I saying? 20-time, 100-time increase in the amount of donation for ALS and so on and so forth. So you're getting action, but it's you're getting the kind of change that you want over there, but you were doing it very differently from.
Now, knowing now what you just said, if you were to change one aspect of society uh, where involves a behavior change, what do you think is what would you do? There's so many parts of our society are sort of
I want our
dysfunctional.
brightest minds to want to work for social good, right?
Yeah.
I mean, today, if I look at so much of stuff from 30, 40 years ago, I was not thinking, I didn't know there was a social sector. So willy-nilly, you're getting into either I'm going to go work in the government, become an IAS officer or something, or I'm going to go work in the corporate sector, or I have my own business, which is also in the corporate sector. So you work for either Sarkar or Bazaar.
Okay.
You don't think of Samaj. You don't think there's a career in Samaj. And yet, the biggest challenges that we have as a country, as a world, is got to be in the social sector. Because whether it's climate change, whether it's inequality, whether it is, there's so many issues that we have got to deal with, so the brightest minds are required over there. And we need to therefore, as a society, change that and say, we want to pay them well so that they can therefore at least well enough to like live a life, dignified life. Because today, people, even when they donate money, they say, oh, we'll give money for books. We won't give money for overheads for NGOs. Well, if you don't give money for overheads, how is that NGO going to work? The NGO is not going to survive. So you have to use the same standards for NGOs that you use for corporate sector. There is a TED talk by a guy called Dan Palota that I recommend everybody listen to. Okay, 18-minute talk where he basically talks about this whole thing, this whole idea of the double standards that society's got for the corporate world and for the social sector. And if I was that one thing I could change, it would be that at least bring it on par, bring Samaj on par with Sarkar and Bazaar. And, and there are many people who are actually talking about this. This is not just me spouting stuff, right? For example, our ex-RBI governor, Raghuram Rajan, my batchmate actually, I mean, he's written a book which is called The Third Pillar. And the whole point is that the reason society is the way it is because the state and the market have colluded on many things to the detriment of the general society, right? There are various other economists who've written books on this with ideas which are great. And maybe somebody will be able to come up with this third way, which is neither capitalism nor socialism. So I'm not, a leftist and saying, oh, we have to do I don't think, because communism doesn't have an answer for global climate change, doesn't have an answer for, efficiency and so on and so forth. But capitalism, the way it exists, cannot continue because we can see that the resources aren't there. And so I can talk like this for hours if you want. But that's the social sector side of me, and which I feel very strongly about.
Well, that's very interesting because most people sort of don't have a sense of the social sector. I mean, and the sense and the definition of social sector also is a little unclear to them. I think hopefully we've sort of cleared the definition out there.
No, I think,
what the social sector also means, and
so I think young people today. So the word social sector, NGOs, etc., doesn't evoke anything. But young people today are a lot more idealistic than maybe my generation was, right? So today, if you talk to them about air quality, everybody's got to be and say, yeah, we have to change that, right? If you talk to them about gender inequality, people have strong views, right? Maybe castes. Today, the whole Dalit issue is a huge issue in the country and going to become even bigger. And if we don't deal with it, whatever. So I think that there are various things. Inequality has become big and it's going to get bigger over as we go forward, right? So the thing is that they understand all this and they are passionate about it. You can hear them on social media or when you meet in person. But they're very passionate about this. Some of them, but they don't know that there's a career in pursuing this passion. And I think that that's the message
that's the message. Because it's not taught as a discipline in our education system.
Correct.
At least in the West, there is a separate discipline for that. Yeah, Suman's moving on now, coming back again to the world of advertising, which will sort of is main area of discussion here. A couple of questions. One is, you spoke about segmentation, targeting, positioning, all of those things, and deep consumer insights, and that is the bedrock of any successful strategy and the pursuant communications. How does a startup, a bootstrap startup, sort of tackle all these things? It's sometimes the founder's hunch that takes it forward, or how can startups with very limited resources can tackle this problem?
So I wouldn't call it founder's hunch, but I think the founder has a reason for starting what they do. I mean, okay, in some cases, it could just be because somebody in the West got successful, then we just copy it here. Okay. But even then, they think, why did they copy that model and not some other business model that was successful in the West? So it's because they see an insight, right? Every founder has an insight. And so there's something he or she is troubled by. As they say, Steve Jobs says that, I didn't have a phone that I really liked. Or I found a challenge in, I don't know, finding a cab when I wanted to, or whatever it is, right? And therefore is trying to solve a human problem. And the question is, if you have that insight, and so people are usually very successful at the startup level because they are looking at an audience that is often they themselves, right? Somebody like them. And therefore the product and everything else becomes like them. The problem then is that then they put on their thinking hats and say, oh, now I'm a corporate and now I must think in a corporate way and I must do as some other guy, and then they fall into a trap. But initially, I think most startups have the right insight and they're on the way. I think so. I don't think that that's the challenge. I think the challenge is in the second and third product. And I think when they move on, or maybe even in this, when they want to expand the market and they not have enough insights on that.
Another question that I have from another common friend of ours is, given the media fragmentation that exists today, how do new brands or challenger brands make a mark? Somebody just launching, with limited resources, budgets. How does one make a mark?
Right.
Again, it comes back to the classical principles of advertising and customer relationship building.
So I think that we should not use the word advertise, right?
Okay.
I mean, maybe today it's again about creating movements, right? Whether it's in the corporate sector or the social sector, it's about creating movement because it's basically word of mouth, or you might call it viral campaign, or whatever it is. But the insights that go into a viral campaign have to be even deeper. I think the point is your fragmented market can become actually very large because your distribution is not fragmented now. Your distribution systems become so global actually that you got the whole globe as a market, and therefore even if it feels like a very sharp and small sliver, but together that might mean millions and possibly even billions of people, right? So the market is not small because your footprint is so much larger, right? And so, but I think the need is to be that much deeper. I have to love something. So back when I started advertising, when I started in marketing, all you needed was repetition. I could say surf washes whitest, surf washes whitest, and I say it often enough that you will remember surf washes whitest or washing powder Nirma, whatever.
Correct.
Today that doesn't work.
So you just hammer it out.
Is not doesn't
It's
because you
not-
can't hammer because the media is too fragmented, and therefore the only way is for some people to be so passionate about your brand that they become your brand advocates. And the question is, how do they get to be passionate? And again, to make them passionate, you have to get insights. And that's what I mean by saying I'm passionate about air quality. I may be passionate about gender equality. And that is why a lot of brands are working on that. And you can see brands that are working on, are basing themselves on a purpose,
True.
Dove, and with so many other brands, and Always, and so on and so forth. There's so many brands because they're seeing that that's where the passion is, and they want to attach themselves to that passion. So the question for marketers is, which passion are you going after? Whose passion is it? And how can you attach your brand to that?
So, Suman, moving on, can you just let's talk about behavioral economics, because that's a deep-rooted science. There's a lot of research that's gone behind it, and it's known to work. There's nudge theory, there's behavioral economics. Can you sort of, for our audiences, lay down some definition of that and some examples of how it worked for brands and businesses?
Let's start by saying, what is this whole science all about?
Yeah.
Okay, and Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who are the people who invented this whole science, they found that there are two parts to our brains. There is the system one part of our brain, which you might call the reptilian part of the brain or whatever, which is this part that is, always working. Okay, that's the part that regulates all your body functions, but it also instinct and various other things comes from there. And then there is the system two part of our brain. Some people might call it the rational brain or the thinking brain, which is good at analytics and is good at problem solving, all of that, very rational, but takes a lot of energy, huge amounts of energy. So what the brain does is it actually works on system one most of the time
Okay.
and wakes up system two only when required. Now the challenge is that when you are communicating, when you're saying anything, when you're doing behavior, we tend to communicate with system two. So if I was to talk to you about gender issues, let's say, so I can talk to you logically and I say, men and women are the same and they should be at the same level, and you will agree with me and so on. And because the system two part of your brain, the logical part of your brain understands this and says, that's fine. But your biases are hidden in system one.
True.
And so maybe because of our generations of the way we've been brought up in our families and whatever else, maybe there's something in us which is saying, okay, their men and women are not equal.
Not equally correct.
Or perhaps, some other God. So there are so many. So the whole point about the science of behavioral science is to find these biases and heuristic. Heuristic is rule of thumb that the system one uses to behave. Because what they found is that 96% of decisions taken by human beings are because of system 1. And system 2 is only involved with 4%.
Oh, really? Okay.
And yet all our communication, all our logic is aimed at system 2. So all these brands that are trying to say transactional, you're only dealing with system 2, right? So a simple example, if imagine that there is a pack of something that you're going to buy, and you go to the market and that same pack is available, same brand is available with 2 offers. One says 25% off, and the other says 33% extra free. And I do this in all my workshops, and I say, which one would you buy? And a lot of people will say 33% extra.
Because the number looks bigger.
Looks bigger.
Absolutely.
The reality is that they are the same.
The same.
The unit price is the same, 25% off, 30% extra, same unit price, doesn't matter. You spend 2 minutes thinking about it, you will find that answer. But people will just go after one because people don't use system 2 part of their brains, the system 1. So even a so-called transactional relationship is like that. No, there are many other kinds of things. So for example, if I want people to eat healthy, right? And, Richard Thaler, who's the first guy who
won the Nobel Prize as well.
Nobel, so he also, along with Daniel Kahneman won it earlier. So he's the father of what you might call behavioral economics, because Kahneman and Tversky were psychologists, even though Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in economics. Anyway, so Richard Thaler found he's trying to get school kids in America to eat more healthy. Now, they wanted them to eat fruit compared to, say, ice cream. All they did was change the position such that the fruit was in front and ice cream was, you have to take one more step to get the ice cream. Just that one extra step, people started eating more fruit.
Oh.
It's just that making it slightly more difficult, isn't it? You think of something like smoking, right? Today, there is no smoker who does not know that smoking is injurious to health. So it's written big and bold on every pack.
And a big gory image on the pack as well.
Correct. So there is no question of saying, let's create awareness that smoking is bad. No, it does not lead to. And in fact, there is data. And again, you can see the fall. There is a fall. So if every time they wrote this and they put the picture, there is a little bit of fall in smoking. But what made it really work was, he said, you can't smoke inside offices. You can't smoke in public places. You can't smoke in restaurants, shops, this, that. And suddenly that behavior change has made it inconvenient for you.
Correct.
So now I have to go out into the heat and maybe it's raining or whatever, and then I have to go and smoke. So forget it.
So they put the stumbling block in front of you.
So either I can incentivize, and I don't have to give you an incentive. I make it easier for you to do something.
Or difficult for
you to do something else. And by doing so, I change behavior.
So either that's an important point. Either you make it easier or make it difficult to sort of wean something off.
Actually, there is an equation which the guy called Professor Fogg came up with. It says B is equal to MAT, which stands for behavior, is equal to motivation multiplied by ability multiplied by trigger. So ability is how easy is it? Okay. So so either you have to make it easier.
I think I've read this book.
Yeah, it's in my books. So you're basically saying, how can I either increase motivation, make something easier? Okay. Those are the two main things. But at very low levels of motivation, sometimes you need a trigger to get them moving in that. So that's the third thing, the trigger. So essentially, you could do something in either of any of these three places, and they might have a multiplier effect, assuming that the other twigs. So that is how you have to study this. Now, I must say that for the last 10 years or something like that, maybe more, I have been focusing my entire mind on the social sector. So all my examples are currently social sector.
Yeah, that's okay, but as long as those principles are valid,
yeah. How do I ensure that kids in slum areas don't take drugs? And there's this organization in Bombay only called Oscar for Foundation. It's run by a guy called Ashok Rathore. And basically his whole idea was, let me create alternative role models. Because the cool guys in the slum were the guys who were doing dope and drinking and right? Because they are the cool guys, right? They are the happening guys. And so the other youngsters want to look up to them, and therefore they will also start to drink or dope or whatever it is. Because, so he said, the only way to get them out, he said, myself or my brothers and sisters, was to create a different role model. And he used football as that role model. So he created football academies in the slums, right, where you could come and sort of and these kids today, he's got teams that have gone to girls football teams that have gone to Spain and England to play.
Wow.
He's had some of his kids get into the Indian Soccer League.
What is it called?
Oscar Foundation.
Oscar Foundation.
Which is such a brilliant idea. And he's now a FIFA brand ambassador himself. FIFA is one of his funders because, so, using football for good kind of thing. And, so they fund NGOs. He's one of the NGOs funded by them. And he himself is a FIFA brand ambassador. And he's from that same slum, by the way. He's from that slum in near Cuff Parade, which is where he started. So now this is a phenomenal example of using a nudge to change people away from taking drugs.
Interesting. Very
It is.
very interesting example of a nudge.
And there's so many. Earlier when I spoke to you about Earth Hour or Red, and these are all examples of using nudge.
Okay, so I'm just sort of going through your LinkedIn profile. A couple of things are interesting. One thing that caught my eye was you changed your jobs when India's hosted the World Cup. Can you just sort of talk us through that part?
Yeah. Well, India's hosted the 50 over World Cup 4 times. I started my career in 87, the first time that India hosted the World Cup. I did my first job change in 1996, which is the second time India hosted the World Cup, which was the Wills Trophy. And then in 2011, I quit the corporate sector, started my consulting firm. And so that was in the year 2011 when, Dhoni's team won the World Cup. And then in the year 2023 now, which is the latest time that India hosted the World Cup, I decided I had had enough and I kind of retired from the corporate sector.
So your entry and exit and the changes in between have coincided with the World Cup.
India hosting the 50 over World Cup. Important.
50 over World Cup. Very interesting anecdote over here. I think a lot of your work also has been related to cricket. You gave the Bunty Babli example, and then the other example you gave was in 2007 when only Rohit Sharma was the metro-centric player and everybody else was from other parts. Okay, Suman, as we try to wrap it up, can you sort of give us an example of a nudge theory which has worked, for ages to come?
Yeah, so my favorite example is from the Indian independence struggle and what Gandhiji was able to do. Because if you remember, before Gandhiji came to India, the Congress party was an elitist party. It was made up of people who were educated, or a lot of them were lawyers and businessmen, and they were rich people, etc. So it was not really connected with the masses. Masses did not understand the idea of India, did not understand the idea of independence. And Gandhiji realized that if he was to create a movement where all of India together would work to throw out the British. As in the movie Gandhi, he says, 100,000 Englishmen cannot control 300 million Indians if the Indians refuse to cooperate. And how does he do that? So that's the whole idea, where he used the idea, where if you say, what was the motivation? The idea of, being freedom, etc. But then he translated this abstract ideas into some very specific things. If you wanted to join the freedom movement, what did you have to do? Wear khad. What else did you have to do? Buy don't pay salt tax, basically. Buy the other kind of salt. You could go and walk with him. When he did the Dandi March, he went from Sabarmati Ashram to the Dandi beach, which is a distance of about 300 kilometers. It took 35 days. Why? Because he made a meandering strategy. Other leaders did other walks. So people would walk for 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers with him. So it became a mass movement because of this mass contact. So everything from purpose to behavior change to movement, all the principles get encapsulated in his strategy.
That's fascinating over there. All right, thank you. I think with that, we'll end our discussion over here. Suman, thank you once again for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for
All right,
having me.
thank you.